Strait of Singapore, a 113-kilometer waterway connecting the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. It is patrolled by the region's most modern naval force. But despite this, it is a hotspot for maritime piracy and sea robberies. Why does this happen to Singapore? Let's talk about that today. The Singapore Strait, the world's second busiest waterway. According to figures released by anti-piracy watchdog Recap, there were 55 armed robbery cases recorded in the Singapore Strait in 2022. This accounts for more than half of cases reported across Asia for the year. The ever-increasing cases raises questions over Singapore's maritime agencies and their enforcement efforts in the Singapore Strait. Why is the figure so high? And is Singapore doing enough to combat piracy and sea robberies? There are three factors that can explain the high number of cases. But before that, it is important to understand that despite its name, the Singapore Strait has three littoral states that maintain sovereignty over it. The three states are Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia.
So I'm standing here in Marina South Pier, and from where I'm standing, you are able to appreciate how narrow the Singapore Strait actually is. You can actually see the Indonesian islands of Batam and Bintan from here.
And herein lies the first factor that will explain why cases continue to flourish. And that is the lack of a good reason for Indonesia or Malaysia to devote resources into a waterway that primarily benefits Singapore. It is a simple question. Why should they? At any one point of time, there are at least 1,000 vessels in the Singapore Strait. And the port that benefits most from this is the Port of Singapore. For Malaysia, its busiest port is the Port of Klang along the Malacca Strait. And for Indonesia, its busiest port is the Port of Tanjung Priok near Jakarta. Remember, waters around these ports are also prone to maritime crimes. Given their limited resources, why shouldn't these countries deploy their naval and coast guard vessels to these respective ports instead of the Singapore Strait, despite having responsibilities over parts of this important waterway? A second factor that can explain the number of piracy and sea robbery cases is the geography of the Singapore Strait. Despite its prominence, the Singapore Strait is a very shallow waterway. Its average depth is only about 22 meters, and parts of it are inundated with features such as submerged sandbars. This makes it very tricky for law enforcement patrol vessels to pursue perpetrators, who are usually found on fast motor-powered flat-bottom vessels known as sampans. These sampans can easily cut across sandbars and escape into their country's territorial waters, while patrol vessels will have to take the longer route around these features. There are no maritime hot pursuit arrangements between the governments of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. As such, Singapore law enforcement vessels are not allowed to cross into the territorial waters of either Indonesia or Malaysia to apprehend these perpetrators. Meanwhile, pirates and sea robbers continue to wait alongside these maritime borders, waiting for an opportunity to strike at ships in the Singapore Strait when our patrol vessels are not in the vicinity. Given the availability of open source information such as AIS, which are freely available to anyone, It is easy for the perpetrators to identify the most suitable targets as they wait alongside these maritime borders. And lastly, but perhaps the most important factor that can explain piracy and sea robbery cases in the Singapore Straits is the sheer number of ships that go through the waterway daily, from oil tankers to cargo vessels and tugboats. These provide ample opportunities for those looking to make a quick buck. This is especially so during times when prices of commodities like oil and scrap metals reach record highs. For now, there are no easy solutions to this problem. Efforts to combat piracy in the Singapore Strait must include the same levels of dedication from both Indonesia and Malaysia. But given the tendency that both countries will focus on their own ports, it is up to Singapore to ensure that this busy waterway remains safe for all those that choose to sail these waters.